Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I appreciate that you all made the trip. For people in the room, appreciate that you got online. For the people who are online, so I'm going to get this thing kicked off. So my name is Scheeff. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of IDefine, and I'm going to try to do kind of a grand overview, I think, of where we are as a community, and also highlight some of the work that IDefine has been doing to try to push forward towards a treatment. So when we started IDefine, we had several goals. One of them was to find targeted treatments for KS. Along the way, we definitely wanted to improve clinical care and build community, and those things are obviously critical and really important in that process as well. And so we've been working along those lines of those goals ever since. And so the way we see this is that there's sort of a system that makes treatments, so the patients are our why. They are why we do what we do. Everyone who started IDefine has an affected child, and so we've all been working on this project for years, and we see this system that involves many pieces as a system that can work, a lot of times doesn't really work that well to generate treatments, and what it really needs is someone to help make all the pieces work together. And so we often think of ourselves as kind of the oil in the gears to make sure that all these groups are talking to each other, to make sure that there's knowledge being shared, to make sure that the process moves forward and that it's focused on the patients and getting something to help those patients. We see development path, particularly for a rare disease, and we know that we have to make it easier to follow. It needs to look. And so we, for years, to try to, it looks like that. We, community in general, has made progress. I'm not going to go into huge detail on everything. The way we look at this is that the years we've really, to get to where we are sort of ready, we're really ready to start treatments and launching a lot of projects, and other people are launching a lot that could potentially. So I think it's a really exciting. There's been this fundamental. Let's go. And it happened along the way. One thing to highlight, I think, have really great on 3 continents. So Boston here, one in the Netherlands, and now one. So we have a natural history study that's been finished. We're going to hear from Joost, who was involved in that study, and a second one that's been started here at BCH. We have had a lot of other things completed, and I'll go through those. And now we're launching a set of different projects to build a set of treatments. So we see 2 big things in the community. Work actual treatment leads, but be working on clinical trial readiness. We don't want to get to the point where we have something really exciting and we say, let's go try this, and then we say, oh wait, we're not ready. We need 3 or 4 years to get ready for a trial. That is not the plan. The plan is when we're ready on both ends. And so we're working on both of these fronts to try to be ready, completely ready when it's time to go to a clinical trial. And then hopefully that leads to approved treatments. And so there's a lot of things in there. And I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit of detail and kind of give an update as to where I feel like we are as a community. So the first thing will be to better understand the mechanisms. Obviously, without a mechanism, challenging to figure out a treatment. And one of the things we've learned recently as a community is, I think, EHMT1, which is the gene that causes KS, I think you all know, is more complex than we even thought. There's a recent paper that's already out, but I just wanted to highlight, which was a really in-depth paper understanding variation in EHMT1 versus the clinical presentation. And one of the interesting takeaways from that paper is that they found a few N-terminal truncations in EHMT1 that produced a very mild presentation. So it turns out you can lose the very N-terminal tip of EHMT1, and that can produce a mild enough presentation that, in fact, in some of these cases, these were running in families. So a very surprising result. Still, for the most part, damaged EHMT1 will cause KS, but we're learning the real fine molecular detail about this protein and everything that it and the ways that it can drive different clinical results. And we're going to have two presentations at this conference. One of them about this kind of complexity, and one of them is going to be by Jackie Harris, who's going to talk about this really exciting case of KS in our community, of someone who basically presented with no neurological symptoms, and yet he has a deletion. So really interesting, that should not happen. So she's been working on better understanding that case. And we're going to hear from Maria, who's going to talk about EHMT2. So EHMT1 and EHMT2 work as a heterodimer, and there's this complex interaction between them, and it turns out that in some cases EHMT2 will produce a Kleefstra-like syndrome. So the next thing we have to have is model systems. We've generated iPSC lines. I'm not going to go into a great amount of depth, but the important thing to know is they're out there, they're available. The MTA is straightforward. We've already given them to 7 labs. So anyone who needs lines, we have them. The other thing we've been working on is trying to make sure that the model space is really well populated for KS. So, our strategy is we should be ready to screen anything that comes along. There may be some things that would screen better in a human-based system, some things that we could screen in mice, and so on. And there's been a lot of work done previously on 2D models using neurons. There's a clear phenotype. We've been working on funding improving those models by adding additional cell types, because it turns out that other cell types are quite relevant in KS. And so we funded work at Radboud in partnership with Cure Epilepsy to improve those models. Another area that we saw when we looked at the landscape that was somewhat empty was the organoid type space. So these are really exciting 3D models using human cells. And so we funded work at UC San Diego to develop models for KS in organoids using those cell lines. And then we were really excited to find that another team at UCLA, who we're going to hear from UCSD and UCLA, and now George from that team is at USC. A little complicated, but the basic story is he was interested in using our cells to also 2 projects going on with organoids, building organoids in 2 different labs with 2 different approaches, because organoids, I've learned, is kind of like cooking. Everybody has a different recipe, and so it's really interesting to see what different recipes produce and what you learn from the different approaches. And Angels from UCSD and George from USC now, because congratulations, George, he got his assistant professorship there. So moved from UCLA to USC. We'll both be presenting at this conference about what they're learning so far about KS by working in organoids. So really looking forward to those updates. The next thing is the availability of patient samples and ensuring that those are always easily available. So we actually have 2 biorepositories. One of those is hosted at Combined Brain, and one of those is hosted at Simon Searchlight. People may ask, why would you have 2 biorepositories? I would ask, why do you have Pepsi and Coke? Some people like one, some people like the other. There are researchers who love to work with Simons. I've heard from researchers, I've seen presentations from researchers that I thought, wow, that was really great work. It would have been awesome if you did that in KS. And when I reached out to them and asked them if they had looked at KS, they said, I went to Simons and I looked at the disorders that had the most samples, and those are the ones I worked with. So it really matters that you have those samples in place and that you have the availability in multiple locations. And so we've worked to make sure that those are available. And at the same time, both of these resources, what's great about them is that they also collect phenotypic data through surveys for everybody that participates. We're going to talk a little bit later, I'll talk a little bit later about the natural history study that's going on at Boston Children's. We are also having samples from those who consent from that natural history study to go to Combined Brain, so we'll also have those in that repository available in the future. And Terry Jo, whose flight got canceled, but she just told me she got another flight on Southwest and she's still coming, is going to give us some updates tomorrow on combined brain, and there's a lot more to combined brain than that biorepository. I just kind of had to put her talk somewhere, but there's a whole set of projects going on at combined brain, which are really exciting, and so she's going to give an overall view of what's going on. I think it's been talked about for a long time, this idea that we should be using, we should be scaling by combining disorders. We should be using platforming technologies, that type of capability. And yet, I think it hasn't happened to the degree that it's needed to, and now we're really starting to see, I think, movement, and a lot of that's being driven by combined brain. And so we have multiple projects now that are combined with other groups. So it's exciting times, I think, in that sense. Okay, so let's talk about investigating candidates. So possible treatment candidates. Every time we get into treatment candidates, there's an elephant in the room, and there's an old saying that if there's an elephant in the room, you should introduce him. So this elephant's name is therapeutic window. This comes up all the time. What is the therapeutic window? I'm optimistic. I'm quite optimistic. There's a lot of information to me that suggests that we should all be optimistic. In flies, you can turn EHMT, there's only one in flies, back on, and you can restore basically memory and other functionality in the flies. I'll come back to the mouse in a second. There's some really good data there. And then in mature 2D networks of neurons, you can rescue those networks. And then we do have a little bit of human, we're still early compared to some other groups that I'm going to get to, but we do have human data for olanzapine, which is kind of becoming recognized as a drug that can help in some cases of regression in KS. And the regression takes place in puberty, so this is later in life, and that drug often can block the progression of regression, suggesting that, right, it's not something that was locked in development, it's something that's happening and can be treated. And so I think that's the one piece of human data we have, and it's encouraging. And then I think other human data, we have to jump to other NDDs, but I think they're also very, let me get to mice first. So this is what was been done with mice. So two big experiments. One is, I think, kind of the obvious experiment. So let's have a mouse that's born with KS and then inducibly turn on the missing EHMT1. So in that experiment, they waited about 3 to 4 weeks, turn it back on again. Now you've got a, should be genetically normal mouse. And what they got after 12 weeks when they did their testing was improvement in phenotype, not perfect rescue, but improvement. But then if you do histology, the neuron level rescue was complete. Like they were not distinguishable anymore from the non-induced mice. And they also, in terms of the gene expression patterns they found that they rescued those as well. So I think pretty encouraging, given that mice are not people. I think that's a pretty decent result. And then the other experiment, which I think is also really interesting, was a little bit of brute force, but it was, let's turn this off completely at birth. So if you knock out both copies of EHMT1 in a mouse, it's embryonic lethal. So this team knocked them out at birth so they could get to a birth of the mouse. And what they found is that the double minus mice would go about 6 to 8 weeks looking okay, and then they would just start to fall apart. They'd start to lose behaviors, they couldn't learn things. And so what that says is, this seems to be doing something throughout life, and you need it to learn, and so on. So I think both of those mouse results are pretty encouraging. And then if we look at the other NDDs that are kind of out there that are going through trials, so the Angelman community has had this really exciting result with their ASO that's looking very promising. And in their initial clinical trial, they did kind of that more younger age range, but now they've gone ahead and decided to expand that based on the results they've seen so far, all the way up to 65, so basically no limit. 2 other projects that are a little earlier, Taysha's gene therapy for Rett, they went from 6 to 21, and they've reported that they're seeing improvement in all those subjects so far in this early phase 1/2. And then Pitt Hopkins just started their trial, but they also decided to do a pretty broad age range based on the data that they had going in. So you can kind of see that with a lot of these NDDs with complex genetic underpinnings, there's reason to be optimistic that you can come in relatively late and still provide a substantial benefit. And then when we look at things that have actually been improved for NDDs, we don't have like a gene therapy that's approved yet, but we do have small molecules, and in 2 of those cases, they've been approved based on the data that came in as just for any age, right? So there seems to be a benefit of intervention at any age in these other disorders. So what we think we need to have is really a funnel of possible candidates that are all going in parallel. This is how biotechs approach a problem. They build a funnel, and then over time, they find, one thing's working a little better than another, and so over time, they can select what seems to be the most promising. And we really, as a community, have now, I think, filled that funnel with a lot of exciting projects. So I would split it into 2 different sections. I would say one is the genetic medicines, which is going right after EHMT1 in some way or another to restore proper expression. And then the other one is to treat all the consequences, because of course being underdosed in EHMT1 leads to a lot of other changes downstream. It regulates other genes. And so conceptually, you can then go in with other molecules to try to rebalance the system, let's say, or in the case of olanzapine is a good example. I think it's fair to say that's kind of becoming a repurposed drug. It's an antipsychotic, but it's now being used in a observational study, and Tichka, when she speaks later, is going to talk about this, is now being used to treat regression. Brain model is a really interesting project as well. This is a bench-to-bedside project going on at Radboud to take individual patients, make neurons from those patients, phenotype the neurons, and work on can we find drugs that might help those neurons, and then might those help the patient. So it is like an individual patient-based. And those 2, there we go, okay. And I'll come back to that in just a moment, but I think the other thing I wanted to mention about treatment candidates is that as we're doing this, we are always need to be learning more about KS, and I think we can do those things now in parallel. I think we know enough to start and really start working on treatment candidates, but we're going to keep learning more as we go. And a lot of these candidates will probably teach us things about KS as we evaluate them. There we go. So Tichka is going to speak tomorrow on updates on the initiatives they've got going in the Netherlands, including brain model that I mentioned, and she's going to talk also about the most recent study with olanzapine. And then we have a whole host of folks. Fred's going to talk about the project we've launched on repurposing with Unravel. Riley's going to talk about an upregulation method for EHMT1 that they're working on at the University of Chicago. Steve Gray is going to talk about, hey, let's just go straight for gene therapy, why not? So Steve's going to talk about that. And then Jeff is going to talk about another upregulation methodology that we're also working on. So a lot of stuff now in the funnel, and so we're going to hear from the folks who are working on those projects at this conference. The last thing is going to be translating leads, so we're not there yet. But what I've learned from talking to people who have done it is you don't do it, it's not an after process, it's something you need to be thinking about as you're building the leads. And so Yael Weiss is going to come present to us her experience going to trial with a Pitt-Hopkins gene therapy, getting from a result in an academic laboratory to an IND, and all of the things she learned along the way, which I think is going to be really exciting to hear about and learn from, because it is challenging. It's a different world to get the FDA to let you do a trial. So we'll hear from her about that. And then in terms of clinical trial readiness, one of the things that's obviously important is building centers of excellence. I alluded to that earlier, that we now have 3 really strong ones. We're now over 120 unique patients. I don't know, Zoe, what's the latest number, do you remember? 126. 126 unique patients seen in one location by one team who know Kleefstra syndrome, who don't say, wow, you're the first one I've seen, which is what a lot of our families get when they find out they got the diagnosis. They say, oh, you're the first one I've seen. That's not true at BCH. So huge value for the patients. But also the halo of having a COE is really considerable. It opens the doors to all sorts of other activities. One of those is, there we go, okay. One of those is some additional, more in-depth study of KS, and so there's been work going on at BCH around that, and Raja is going to speak to that, learning more about the neuropsychiatric profiles seen in KS. And then I can tell you as a parent, sleep is a huge issue with KS and a real struggle for a lot of families. And so Sarah has been doing a lot of work understanding what exactly is going on with EHMT1 and circadian rhythms, and she's going to be giving us an update on that. And then Emma is going to come in remote from Australia and tell us about what they've learned running the Kleefstra Syndrome Clinic in Sydney. So natural history studies, I think we're really making great progress here. And again, this is part of this halo effect of having this COE at BCH. So there's been two, one that started and one that's finished and now is about to be published, getting close. And we'll hear from Joost about that natural history study. So the first one that has been done is 13 and older, and it was more focused on the natural history of what you see around this time of regression, which, as I've mentioned, is really important. And then can you treat that regression? And but we looked at this and said, okay, that's great, and we also have to make sure we now fill out the younger ages. And so we're doing a natural history study that we are partnering with BCH on to do 2 to 21. But the focus of that primarily is on 2 to 11, the idea being that when they finish out the end of this natural history study, they will start to head into 13, and so we'll have a complete coverage of the age ranges. So that's 30 participants, and definitely we're focused on that eventually this puts us in a position to get to validated endpoints and even maybe biomarkers if things go really well. So really excited about that project. And as I mentioned, Joost, the first study that's been completed, he's going to come in remote and tell us about the latest that's getting close to publication. So he's going to give us the latest update on, as they've been crunching the data, what they're learning. Alternative natural histories. So I think this is another really exciting area. What's great about natural history studies is that they're the gold standard. You're able to follow the exact same patient at more or less perfectly spaced times, et cetera, but they have to be small unless your budget is insane, right? And so these more alternative methods like Citizen Health, where they're pulling in the digital health records from a person's healthcare journey and then processing all that data, open up the door, I think, to a lot of other possible ways to learn about the syndrome. And my hope is that we can get all of this data and really push it all together and produce something that's really high quality that will yield the best possible ways to measure improvement in patients. And Nasha, she wears two hats. She is part of the executive team at Citizen Health, but also a parent of a child with FOXG1 and leads the FOXG1 Foundation. Will talk to us about how they use the Citizen Health system to generate a digital natural history study that they were able to get through the FDA to use in their upcoming clinical trial for their gene therapy candidate. And as you saw in that last slide, we already have a gigantic set of Kleefstra patients in that system, and we expect that after this conference and encouraging the families that attend to also join, that we're going to have even more. We probably can get above 200. So that can be really powerful data. Two more things that are worth mentioning. I think it's more to sort of celebrate that we did it, but to make sure that everyone knows about it, is the disease concept model and the clinical guidelines. Again, this is now published, is the formal way of understanding what's important to patients and families. It's done, it's out. And then the lines, again, this was partly done in Radboud, I think partly done in Sydney. Basically everybody who's helped create and guide of these guidelines, which are really important. And those are going to be in more depth, actually, because for the guidelines for patients. So that's where we're presentation through that and how to use those and how to bring those in front of your doctor. But again, it's that problem of, well, now when you're the first one I've seen, they can, here's the guidelines. Let's look at these together and work from. So really important. And here, but also helping all the patients stay organized, connected, which brings patients. Our map's now over 1,100 people, so really exciting to have all those people worldwide. They're all people that we can contact if there is a trial, if there's an opportunity. We use this list of contacts to let people know about opportunities to participate in different options for us as a community. And we're now almost to 400 in the US, and a lot very quickly grow. And again, I think after this conference, it's going to grow some more. There's always people who just haven't heard of it or haven't done it yet for some reason, and we'll let everybody know they should join the map. Another thing just to celebrate, this happened a while ago, but we have an ICD-10 code. We are a recognized syndrome in the US medical system. My son has been coded by his doctor, so it's in there, and that means that even if you haven't raised your hand in the future, if people use the code, which is always the challenge, but we are always educating people to use it, that we can find people in the medical systems if an opportunity arises in the future for them. And then finally, discovering biomarkers. So hear this over and over again, biomarkers are really valuable if you can get them. Very challenging for an NDD. You're talking about something you can easily measure that's marking something that's going on in the brain, but I think from what I've seen, there's, again, reason to be optimistic that it may be possible. And so Anna's going to talk about work she's been doing, and again, this is one of these shared projects that I alluded to at Combined Brain, where multiple groups contributed samples, and then proteomics were done on those samples, and she's been crunching that data to look at possible targets for what could be used for biomarkers in NDDs from blood. And Danny, more diagnosis area, I think that there's a lot of work around signatures, doing long reads. Potential there also to learn not just about how to diagnose might mean for that also may become the future. So I'm slotting that section. And refining endpoints. So again, that we're still learning what our endpoints are going to be, an area we're going to need to work on in the future. We've got a lot going on. We have a lot more to do. And that's why we're all here. Over questions I had, quickly put them up. And, while they sit, and I think these are all just questions that we need to I'm just going to thank everybody for here in person. Really appreciate you spending your time with us. I really appreciate your interest in KS. Thanks so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the talks. Thank you.